Hello, class. I hope you are able to watch the last week's lecture. I hope you did the readings that I posted. They were relatively short. I hope you were able to watch some of these supplemental videos that I posted. Also, if you have not registered an opinion on the discussion question, which is about original sin, I would encourage you to do that because that's how I'm evaluating class participation. So that's something that you need to do in order to be sure that you get class participation grades. Also, your second reflection paper was due to me today, the 30th, just checking my calendar. So if you have not sent that to me, I do need that. All your other dates will still be in effect. Let's see, that was your reflection paper. Oh, I have the wrong one here, the wrong syllabus. Let's see, this is a revised one here. Nope. But then your next project that's due is your webliography. So be sure, I'm sorry, I just didn't have my syllabus handy and I have to pull it up on Canvas. And I can't really do that right now and continue the lecture. So don't forget your webliography. Now, here's what I'm looking for with the webliography. I'm going to draw you a handy little example. I've already explained it to you. Everything's going to crash around me. Explained it to you before, but let me give it to you again so that you'll hopefully get a clear understanding. I'm going to draw it out so that I can illustrate it for you. So what you want is you give me the URL. For whatever your topic is, let's just say that you're doing something on God. Let's just say that your topic is God, and you find a website. Again, what I'm asking for you is that they be a .edu, .org, or .gov. When you do your searches through the library website, that counts as your online sources. You're going to find articles there that the library does not have on hand. So that's why I call it a webliography, because I'm assuming, with rare exceptions, almost everything that you're going to find is going to be an online source. Even if it would otherwise be a printed version of that. So I'm trying to think of a particular site that might be helpful to you, or that I might use talking about God. I don't know, let's just say you found something at the Catholic University of America. So Catholic University of America, CUA is what we're going to call that. So that's a .edu. And we're going to say that the article that you find is called God and Man. Sorry, here's just it's going to be backwards, but I hope you get what I'm saying here. Again, so we're looking for a .edu, .org, or .gov, and it is the URL that you're looking for is Catholic University of America, CUA, .edu, and I'm sorry this is backwards, and it's called God and Man, is the article that you find that you want to reference in your webliography. Now, what you will put then below the URL is you'll write this website explains the history of humanities. No, it's humanity. Search for the divine being and the elusive answers. So your topic is something about God, and this website explains the history of humanity's search for the divine being and the elusive answers to God's existence. Let's just put it that way, to God's existence. Okay, so that's why this website is useful to you. So you put that down. You don't have to write a lot more than that. Put down exactly why you want to use that website and what's useful on that website. Now, what I'm encouraging you to do, in addition to putting down in your own words why that website is useful, is pull out a quote or two from that website, from that article that you would like to use. So I'm going to make up one here. Professor Smith, let's call him J. Smith, okay? As in the initial J, Smith, of Catholic University of America, said, and I quote, "God can't be put in a box or found like a lost coin." All right, and so I'm going to put that in quotes. So if you were to look at this, or if I was to look at this, so here's what I will see in your paper, and you're supposed to have 8 to 10 of these sources or something like that. So you will have the URL, catholicuniversityofamerica.edu/God and Man. This website explains the history of humanity's search for the divine being and the elusive answers to God's existence. So now you've explained to me why that website is helpful to you. Okay, got that? And in that website, in that article that you read, you found a quote that you think might help. It doesn't mean you have to use that quote or even use that website or that article. It simply means that you found something there that would be helpful, that would be useful. Okay, you got it? And so there's a quote that you think, maybe, possibly, on some outside chance, this is something that you could use for your final paper. And so you put the quote in here. Professor J. Smith, that way you remember who said it, so you're not stealing someone's intellectual property. So Professor J. Smith of Catholic University of America, that reminds you where he was, who it was that said it, where he was, said, "God can't be put in a box or found like a lost coin." So there's your first entry of your webliography. What I would like you to do, it helps me grade them quicker, is to number your sources. So this is your first entry in your annotated webliography. Okay? So what does an annotated webliography mean? It means that you give me a website. That's the web part of it. The annotation means this information right here. You put a note explaining what you found on that website. That would be helpful for you when it comes to doing your paper. Okay? This is kind of your receipt to me to show me that you're doing your work, your research. Most people, in fact, my other class, they did this. It's out of a possible 20 points for them. I think the lowest grade anyone, and that was just a couple of people, they got like a 15 on this. And that's because they didn't put any work into it. They didn't do enough sources, and they only put like one line. I like this website. No, if you put a little bit of effort into this, you can have this turned in. All you have to do is do one site a day for a week, and you've got it done. Okay? So this is simple. Don't make it harder than it is. It's incredibly simple. So just keep it simple. You know what they say, KISS. Keep it simple, stupid. I'm not calling you stupid. That's not what I was saying. I'm simply saying keep it simple. Don't try to make it difficult. Okay. So we need to move on with this lecture and get you a little bit further into the text. I'm really hoping we're not going to fall too far behind on this. I don't think we will. I might even post another lecture tomorrow if I can pull it together, just to be sure we're keeping up. So, in the last lecture, I gave you a thumbnail sketch of Judaism and Christianity, because I thought that that was important to understand the context of what we call the Western world, or Europe, at least, since that is out of which most of the context of our philosophy is coming. So the other thing that I want to say, and I've said since the beginning of the semester, is that your textbook and everything we're talking about is very Eurocentric, very Western world centric. It is a bias in philosophy, if I can say that, because most philosophy talks about Western philosophy. Very little talks about Eastern philosophy. You've heard me say that time and time again when we were in class. So we're going to continue with that bias for the rest of this. Interestingly enough, much of my graduate work was in when my actual work in philosophy was in Eastern philosophy, Indian philosophy, and other Asian philosophies. So I do have probably more background, but those are often relegated to the realm of religious studies rather than philosophy, although they really are philosophies. So with that understanding that we're largely working within a Christian context, there are a couple of things that I want to just call to your attention about the time period in which we began. So we started last week with Augustine, sometimes known as St. Augustine. And St. Augustine lived between the years of 354 and 430. St. Augustine was the last of what we call classical philosophers. So he kind of closes the classical period because around the time that Augustine is dying in Hippo, the Roman Empire is in the process of falling. Now, you should understand that when we talk about the fall of the Roman Empire, we're not talking about something that happened just like that all in one day. This was a process, a series of things that caused Rome to ultimately fall. But then again, it is kind of a mistake to think the Roman Empire as a whole fell. The Roman Empire had been divided into Eastern and Western Empire. So when we talk about the fall of Rome, we're talking about the fall of the western part of the Roman Empire, which is largely centered in Europe. The eastern part of the Roman Empire, which was centered in Byzantium, which would later become Constantinople, is is going to survive for roughly another 1,000 years. When we talk about the fall of Rome, in this context, we're talking about the western part of the empire that falls. The eastern part of the Roman Empire continues, and it goes under the name of Byzantium, or it is the Eastern Empire of the eastern part of the Roman Empire. So Aquinas, Augustine then has a foot in the classical world as Rome is decaying and falling, and he also has a foot in the medieval world, which is about to develop. It's sometimes referred to, so medieval is sometimes referred to as the Middle Ages. Sometimes we'll hear it called the Dark Ages. Now, there are some things to take note of during this time period that are very important to keep in mind, because it explains why we're going to have large gaps, hundreds of years sometimes, between the philosophy that we're talking about at this moment and the next philosophy that we're talking about. In fact, there's 600 to 700 years between St. Augustine and Anselm that we talked about last week. So that's 600 years. It's not that there was nothing going on. It's that with our Eurocentric, Western-centric, there was nothing significant that was happening in the field of philosophy. Now, there were philosophers. Actually, I think I referred to them last week as encyclopedists who were recording lots of things, and they were doing work, and there was philosophy that was happening, but it was on the margins of the culture. It was on the margins of education. So there are some things that go into making the Dark Ages as they're commonly known, and I think this is important for you to remember. Number one, as the Roman Empire is in the process of declining, this centralized powerhouse, this centralized authority of the Roman Empire, as it is declining and going down, in its place arises what is commonly known as feudalism. Feudalism is a system of government whereby, at its heart, there are kings, there are lords, there are vassals, and there are peasants. So there are four castes to society, if you will. And so, whereas Rome was an all-encompassing centralized authority, and everything came down from the Roman emperor, which was part of the fall of Rome, because it was far too centralized for an empire the size that Rome was at that time. And so, as Rome began to decline and lost its place, feudalism then replaced it. Now, feudalism essentially divvied up the European continent, and it's from that all of the multiple countries. So whereas the Roman Empire, in all the place where it was one country, if you will, one empire. As it disintegrated, then you began to get these individual countries with their own leaders. So in England, which had been the northwesternmost reaches of the Roman Empire, you get a number of kingdoms: Wessex, Essex, Sussex, East Anglia. You get a number of kingdoms with their own kings that develop on the islands of Great Britain. And even beyond that, in the area of Scotland, you have the Picts. They're all of these Celtic tribes then develop into their own little nations on the island of Britain. And it's only later that they are assembled into one kingdom, or three kingdoms, four kingdoms, if you will, the kingdom of Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and England. And it's only much later that they are assembled more into one united kingdom. That's where the name comes from. There are these divided kingdoms. But first, you have to assemble England before you can ever assimilate Wales, Scotland, and Ireland into that. Well, just like that was a patchwork there in the British Isles, the same was true all across Europe, all across the European continent. And so what is modern-day Germany was a multiplicity of little principalities, of little kingdoms. It was not the coherent country of Germany that we know today. Same thing with France, with Spain, with areas in Central Europe. All of these then are their own little kingdoms, and they have a king over each one of these. And underneath the king, you have the lords. So the lords essentially they work the land, or they don't work the land themselves, but they manage the land, and then they pay their taxes to the king. And the king then offers a unifying support for the lords. What I want to say, this is still somewhat practiced in parts of Europe, especially the British Parliament. There are two houses to the British Parliament. We seldom hear of one of those houses. Just like the United States Congress is divided into an upper house and a lower house. In the upper house, you have the senators. In the lower house, you have the representatives. Well, in the British Parliament, there are actually two houses as well. It is bicameral in the same way. The lower house is called the House of Commons. You shouldn't take that for granted. That's actually important to remember. It's called the House of Commons because it's made up of commoners, which comes out of this feudal idea. The upper house of British Parliament is made up of the House of Lords. And many of these lords, they're not elected. Most of them are not elected. They inherit their seat by virtue of being born into a particular family. And so you have some of these seats in the in the House of Lords that go back for centuries. And these individuals' grandfathers and great-grandfathers and great-great-grandfathers. Part of the problem with the House of Lords is that sometimes they don't show up to work. Because not much of what they do really matters. They simply have the title House of Lords. I shouldn't say that it doesn't matter. They are integral to the British parliamentary system, but basically whatever the House of Commons does is usually what becomes law in England. So within this feudal system, so you have the kings up here at the top, and they will assemble armies to protect the realm if necessary. Below them, you have the lords. And then below the lords, you have the vassals or knights. And they then serve the lords. And then below that, at the lowest rung on the ladder, you have the peasants. The peasants work the land. That is their primary function. Their primary responsibility. Most of them will never leave the country side, the little village where they live. Many of them live inside the castle walls. The castles, we think they're just these huge places, and only the king lives there, or the lord lives there. No, many of the peasants lived inside the castle walls. One of the most fascinating places. I think it was in Prague, the Prague Castle. I think that's where it was. When you go to the castle and the homes of the peasants are built into the castle wall. The walls were quite thick, but that's very often part of what reinforced that were the houses of the peasants, the peasantry that lived then inside the castle walls. And then they would take the outer wall of the castle and they would build their houses using the outer wall of the castle, and their house would be built then, and that would reinforce the castle wall as well. So the peasants lived inside, and that was the Lord's responsibility to provide protection for them. That's why there are so many castles all over Europe. It comes out of this feudalistic system. So as the Roman Empire fell, on the ascendancy was the feudal system. There are some other things that are going on that contribute to what we call the Dark Ages as well. And one of them is the rise of Christianity. It was not a great force to some extent during the Dark Ages. There were lots of superstitions that developed within Christianity during this time that led people to be afraid to discuss certain topics, to engage in certain activities, especially what we would call higher learning. So the very fact that I'm teaching you these things and that you're sitting there and you're watching a video and you're learning these things, that would have been prohibitive during the Dark Ages, because there was a fear among the lords and others that if the peasants were to be educated, that would become a danger. And so what people were taught then were the superstitions and doctrines of the church. That was primarily what they wanted them to know. If you're Roman Catholic and you're listening to this and you learned in your CCD class, that's out where some of this comes from, because where CCD comes from, because this was what was taught. So the most education that people would have would be what the church believed and what the church said the Bible said. So you weren't even allowed to read the Bible for yourself if you could read, which most people could not read. They were simply taught these things, believe these things, A, B, C, D, E, and they weren't taught how to read and critically think about them. And so that was simply what they believed. And so superstitions would develop. People then would deduce their own ideas, and they would mix their own fantasies and their own personal folklore with the doctrines of the church as well. And so reason then was despised. Philosophy then was despised. And certain ways of thinking were entirely forbidden. It got so bad during the Dark Ages, during the Middle Ages, that they were straining for things to debate in their places of any type of higher learning, which were controlled and run by the church at the time. And so there was one famous argument. If you don't believe me, you can look this up, Google it, put me on pause right now and Google it. One of the debates was how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. And there were answers to this. There were serious arguments about how many angels could dance on the head of a pin. And so reason, intellect, was despised. There are other things that are happening. Disease. The very fact that people did not travel very far from the village in which they were born, that was a good thing and bad thing, because it kept them there. And so if a disease came into a village, it would decimate the population, would decimate the people. At the same time, if you did contract a disease and you tried to escape, like they're alleging some people in New York are leaving New York and they're going to Rhode Island, they're going to Pennsylvania, things like that. If you did contract a disease and you tried to escape your city, because you would carry the disease with you to the next town, that caused the spread of things like the Black Plague. which ravaged Europe on several occasions, but especially toward the end of the Dark Ages. So there are a couple of other things to keep in mind as well. All of these kings that I talked about that developed during this feudal system, feudal form of government, they would also go to war with each other. And so there was constant infighting throughout Europe as we know it, as one king would go to battle against another king for more land, wealth, one thing or another. It was only later, I always found this interesting, that one of the ways that they tried to prevent frequent wars was that they would marry their children into each other's family because they thought that would help prevent wars. And so I might give my daughter, as king, I might give my daughter to you as king, to your son, so that there would be an alliance between us and we would not be so quick to go to war with each other. But then there was another foe that developed that challenged Christianity during this time, that challenged much of Western Europe during this time, and that is the Muslims. So Islam was primarily developed, and now we're getting into your textbook a little bit. Where if you're picking up, trying to follow along, we're about on page 127. Islam developed from a particular guy by the name of Muhammad. Muhammad's he was as a young child he was largely orphaned, and he traveled with his uncle throughout the Middle East. And I don't want to go too much into it, but he lived between the years of 570 and 632 in the Arabian Peninsula. And he was given a message by Gabriel, the archangel. Yes, that is the same Gabriel that Christians speak of. So there is some commonality there. And he was given the Quran. And this is not a world religion class, so I'm not going to go into that very much. But Islam, in its early days, they had a number of battles in the Arabian Peninsula, and there were a number of people converted to Islam. Many of them had no religion at all. Some of them were Jews, some of them were Christians, but many of them, if they had a religion, it was polytheistic religions, tribal religions that existed there in that region of the Middle East. And within about 100 years of Muhammad's death and the rise of Islam, the birth of Islam, Islam had swept all the way across northern Africa and had made inroads into Europe, in particular into Spain, and going up into what we know today as parts of France. And so in addition to kings battling with each other within the European continent of all these little feudalistic states, you now have Islam taking a foothold in Europe, and so you have a number of these kings then going to battle against Islam. Now, I want to say a word or two about Islam. They were stridently monotheistic. In other words, they believed in one God. And so, inasmuch as they understood the Jews to believe in one God, they could agree with them. Christians, however, have always been looked at as suspect by the Jews and the Muslims. So whereas Christians claim to be monotheistic, there is a question whether or not Christians are actually truly, really monotheistic because of the doctrine of the Trinity. Now, the doctrine of the Trinity is in the Christian scripture is nowhere spelled out, but it was around in the 300s, 330 or something like that, around the Council of Nicaea, where the doctrine of the Trinity was established. And this is essentially the belief that there is one God eternally existing in three persons, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. But they are not individual beings. They are part of one God. It is the most baffling, if you will, doctrine within Christianity because some, especially Muslims and Jews, through the centuries have looked at Christianity as being a polytheistic religion because of this belief in the Trinity. Christians would argue, on the other hand, that no, we just simply believe that there are three expressions for God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, that there are not actually three distinct gods, three distinct beings. But nevertheless, inasmuch as Muslims then could view Christians as being monotheistic, they could agree. And so not everyone was forced to convert. One of the most remarkable places was in Cordoba, Spain, where Muslim, Christians, and Jews coexisted with each other side by side and would even, to some extent, worship together. It actually, if you think about it, it would be quite easy for Muslims, Christians, and Jews if they wanted to worship literally in the same space. Being built right now in Abu Dhabi or United Arab Emirates, somewhere UAE, somewhere in on the Arabian Peninsula. There's being built right now 3 houses of worship, Muslim, Christian, and Jewish, and they are built all on the same site and connected to each other. But if you think about it, Muslims, they primarily worship on Friday. They go to Juma prayers on Friday. Jews primarily worship on Saturday, that is their Sabbath. And most Christians worship on Sunday. So it would be conceivable for these 3 to worship in one place, one on Friday, one on Saturday, one on Sunday. And so even as the Muslims conquered parts of Spain, and made inroads into what is today known as France, it was conceivable, and there were places where they did have harmony in spite of the fact that there were places where there were intense battles. It was probably more a battle for land than it was anything else. It probably was not theological that caused most of those battles. But one particular thinker out of Cordoba, Spain, was Averroes. Some of you, if you speak Spanish, you might be able to pronounce the name better than I. He was a Muslim thinker, and he lived around the year 1126 to 1198. So now we're entering the late Middle Ages, the later Middle Ages. Anselm, who I talked about last week, lived in the year 1033 to 1109. And so Averroes lives in 1126 to 1198. So we're getting into the later Middle Ages. And one of the things that he taught, because the Muslims are credited with largely preserving many of the classical works. We would not have much of Plato, Aristotle's works, other classical works like that, had it not been for the Muslims and to some extent the Jews. And so as he was translating some Aristotle and Plato and things like that, he began to make a distinction between what we will call theological truth or God's truth, revealed truth, and philosophical truth. And so he developed what is sometimes known as the doctrine of double truth, that there is one truth that is true spiritually and another truth that is true philosophically. Now, whereas that has often been challenged, I like to think of it this way, because this is how I understand it in my own life. Two things can be true at the same time. Sometimes those two things that are true can be contradictory. Something that is not contradictory, I am both a son and a husband. Those are two truths that can exist simultaneously. There are other truths that would seem sometimes to contradict each other, and nothing in particular comes to mind right now. Well, maybe something like you can be happy and sad at the same time. You can be happy that maybe you're getting to study at home and you don't have to go to class, or maybe you're getting more hours at work because of the global pandemic. But you can also be sad because you're not able to get together maybe with your grandparents for fear of giving them the disease, or you can be sad because you miss some of your friends. So things that seem to be contradictory there, in that particular case, two emotions that seem to be contradictory can exist simultaneously. And so what he had developed was the doctrine of double truth. Now that's not exactly what he's talking about there. Again, he's talking about spiritual truth versus philosophical truth, but nevertheless, he did believe that those two could exist. Another thinker that I really won't go into very much was a Jewish thinker who lived around the same time. His name is Maimonides. You can read a little bit about him there, but he was well known. He is still revered by many Jews today. In fact, I believe that there is a Maimonides medical center in Queens or Brooklyn or somewhere like that. So keep that in mind. But now, what I really wanted to get to for this lecture is the person of Aquinas. And I wanted to talk a little bit about Aquinas. So one of the challenges, one of the two challenges that I think it's important to keep in mind as we enter upon talking about Aquinas, Thomas Aquinas. His philosophy, by the way, is sometimes called Thomism, Thomism, Thomism. Two of the problems that he primarily tries to deal with and tackle are the reconciliation of faith and reason. How do you reconcile faith and reason, and the problem of universals? So these are a couple of the things that he tries to tackle. Now, what are the problem of faith and reason? What is the problem of universals? When we talk about the problem of faith and reason, we have to begin to think about how do we reconcile belief in God with the world, which we understand primarily more in sensory or scientific terms. How do we reconcile belief in God, which we cannot see, with a world which we can see and which we know are bound by certain natural laws? And on the one hand, on the one extreme, you might say, well, your textbook cites the ancient theologian Tertullian, where he said, "I believe the absurd." Now, I don't like the translation, the way that your textbook translate that, in Tertullian saying, "I believe the absurd." That is what he said, but the translation there, believe, the word there is credo, which can be translated, "I give my heart to, I pledge my heart to." So Tertullian, whereas on the one hand you could translate it, "I believe the absurd," he could have been saying, "I give my heart to the absurd." And so as a Christian, certainly believing in a God that became incarnate, who died and rose again, and during his life identified with the poor and the downtrodden and the outcasts. Certainly that is kind of absurd to the rational mind. And so when Tertullian says, I believe the absurd, it could equally be translated, I give my heart to the absurd. And it's a little bit easier to understand what Tertullian is saying. But nevertheless, when you're trying to reconcile faith and reason, it can be difficult to bring together scientific and sensory understanding with faith. This idea that there is a God and God created things and God exists. It's not difficult for everyone to make that reconciliation. One of the things I like to challenge people with is, do you know where Darwin is buried? You probably don't know where Charles Darwin is buried. He is the father of what we know of as evolution. And Charles Darwin is buried in Westminster Abbey in London. It's a church. It's why it's called an abbey. Charles Darwin is buried there. There are other great scientists who are buried there. I think Stephen Hawking was going to be interred there as well. I'm not sure about that, but I think he was, because there is a place there, the Scientist's Corner, which is reserved for the most revered scientists of England. And so there is an attempt, at least within a religion like Anglicanism, to reconcile faith and reason. But I digress. Let me go on and talk about the other problem, is the problem of universals. The problem of universals is, as I might describe it, is the problem of trying to reconcile or trying to understand words. If I tell you this is a cell phone, this is my cell phone, and I know what I'm talking about, but how do I know that you understand it's a cell phone? Maybe you call it a bluebird. And what I call a bluebird is something completely different. Maybe one out there, but it's not this. Maybe you call it a book, cell phone. How do we know we're talking about the same thing, especially if it's not something that we can touch and hold and see? An idea like faith, love, God. How do we know that the words that I use are really conveying to you what it is that I'm thinking about? And so that we're talking about and conversing about the same thing. One of the problem of universals then is to try to understand it like let me explain it the way that I think that the philosophers were talking about. What God said, God's word, then would be absolute and true. But then it is only true if you can understand it with the mind of God. For anything then to trickle down to humanity to be comprehended with our finite minds, then would be a decline, would be a decay, to use Neoplatonic terms, would be a decay in that understanding. And so as it comes down from God, then it has decayed, it has declined, it has been dumbed down so that our finite minds could understand it. It would be an even harder challenge, for example, to explain it's like trying to explain God to a child. How do you explain God to a child? But then the challenge is, how do you really know what we're talking about when we're talking? How do I know what we're talking about when we're talking about God? And are we talking about the same thing? So this is the problem of universals. The way I think about it, and this is what I was going to say just a moment ago, is sort of like the child's game of telephone. So if we were in the classroom right now, I would have illustrated it like this. And I would have started a rumor on one side of the classroom, and I would have sent it all the way around the classroom. And by the time it got through all 37 of us, we would have asked the last person to state what it was that he or she heard, and we would have seen how well it matched up with what it was that I said to begin with. So there is a corruption in the message as it is translated from one person to the next. And so that is the problem of universals. How do we know we're talking about the same thing when we're talking about certain things? How can we be certain that we're on the same page when we're discussing especially things that cannot be touched, tasted, seen, handled, smelt? How can we know we're talking about the same thing? So into this world steps Thomas Aquinas. We're now reaching what would commonly be called the High Middle Ages. And they began around the year 1000. And so with Anselm and others, we began to see an increase in learning and knowledge and reason. The ancient sources that had been preserved by many of these Jews and Muslims, they're being disseminated amongst the Christians, and these Christian scholars are starting to study them. In fact, the year from 1000 to 1300 is sometimes known as the rise of scholasticism. And scholasticism is sometimes, the way to understand it, is the specialization in areas of philosophy. So you get specializations in history, you get specializations in ethics, you get specializations in other areas, but it's also the beginning of the systematic analysis of arguments and logic. So that is scholasticism. So the specializations in areas of philosophy and the systematic analysis of arguments and logic. Classical thinking was considered secular, not religious. And so in the early part of the Dark Ages, it had been despised, it had been shunned, it had even been forbidden. But now, as scholasticism begins to emerge, the High Middle Ages, which will eventually give way to the Renaissance era, is now beginning to dawn. The world, at least the Western world as we understand it, will eventually come out of the Dark Ages. And so one of Anselm was the first flicker of that light. Of course, we had the Maimonides and Arroyos, but Thomas Aquinas is sometimes seen as the light of the late Middle Ages burning at its brightest. Now, I don't expect you necessarily to agree with Thomistic thinking, but for his time, he was quite on the cutting. He was quite much on the cutting edge. And so he was born in 1225 to a family near Naples, a very wealthy, affluent family. He ran away from his family, and he enrolled in a Benedictine abbey to study and become a priest. But while he was there, he discovered the Dominicans, and he decided to become a Dominican. Now, that might not mean much to you, but those are orders within the Roman Catholic Church. Orders of monks, priests within the Catholic Church. There are also nuns who fit into those orders. So you have the Augustinians, you have the Dominicans, you have the Benedictines, corresponding to St. Dominic, St. Benedict, St. Augustine. There are other orders as well. But the Dominicans are especially known for their emphasis on learning. Another group, many of you, if you're Roman Catholic, you might have gone to a Jesuit high school, or you might aspire to go to a Jesuit college. So that's sort of understanding the same thing of what the Benedictines are. The Dominicans are. They found a number of colleges and schools and things like that. So Aquinas then began to apply the scholastic model to multiple topics. And one of the things that he tried to do is he tried to, I should also say, just because your textbook points this out, that Aquinas was quite well fed by the Dominicans. He was so well fed that a niche had to be carved out for him in the dinner table so that he could sit there. So he was very much enjoying the meals. I've known a number of monks. I've been to a number of monasteries through the years, and they don't get to enjoy very much. So eating is something that they can sometimes enjoy, and so they enjoy eating and drinking sometimes. Aquinas apparently enjoyed that too much. But one of the things that he tried to reconcile was the idea of philosophy and theology. He tried to merge the two, and he came up with what, in fact, is still used in the Roman Catholic Church today, is sometimes referred to as natural theology. Natural theology. That is the reconciliation of philosophy and theology. Now, your textbook makes a distinction between revealed theology, which is pure faith, and natural theology, which is proof of reason. So revealed theology would be, and incidentally, Aquinas is the one who is credited then with breaking theology out of philosophy as a separate field and trying to study it. That is part of the scholastic model as well. That is the specialization in a particular area of philosophy. And so natural theology, as Aquinas understood it and as the church continues to teach it, is to simply look at a thing and try to determine exactly what its function is. And so if you see a gazelle on the African savanna, the gazelle's job is to eat some grass, eat some straw, jump around, run. But then let's suppose a lion comes upon that gazelle. Then what is the lion's natural function? The lion's natural function is to kill the gazelle and eat it. And so that would be an example of natural theology. Or think of it in this way. What is the function of the eye? The function of the eye is to see. And so therefore to use the eye to see something is natural. And if you, for example, if you block your eyes, then you are interfering with the natural order of what the eyes were created to do. You're contravening nature when you block your eyes or your nose. Your olfactory senses are to smell. And so if you block your nose, it not only causes you to talk like this, but now you cannot smell. It will also affect your sense of taste. And then you've contravened the natural order of why the eye or the nose, the mouth, the ear was created. Just like if you stopped the lion from killing the gazelle, you would have contravened the natural order. You would have interfered with the natural order. This, incidentally, is why the Roman Catholic Church then has a prohibition against things like contraception. Because to use birth control or to use a condom contravenes the natural order of things. So if you interfere with what nature is trying to do, you are then interfering with nature and you're going against God's will. You're going against the created order, the natural order of things in the world. The natural order is for an egg and sperm to come together. And so that's why in Roman Catholic theology, contraception, whether it's birth control pills or condoms, are forbidden. It comes out of this Thomistic theology. It comes out of Thomas Aquinas. So that is natural theology in a nutshell, as Aquinas then put it forth. But Aquinas is known primarily for a couple of other things. And one of those other things, did it again. You get to 1 hour, it begins to my computer begins to cut off. Didn't throw me as much this time. But Aquinas is known for trying to prove the existence of God without appealing to Scripture. So he tried to prove the existence of God without appealing to Scripture. And this is sometimes, if you'll remember, Anselm's argument for the existence of God was known as the ontological argument, the argument from being. So Aquinas's argument for the existence of God is sometimes referred to as the cosmological argument. And it is derived from this sense, from this natural philosophy or natural theology. And the cosmology, then, you will remember, the word there has to do with the worlds. So this is trying to understand or prove the existence of God by appealing to the natural order, the natural world, in order to prove that God exists. And so he laid out 5 causes, 5 ways to prove the existence of God. So I'll run through them quickly. You can read about them in more detail in your textbook. It begins on something like page 142 and goes for a couple of pages in your textbook. So the first one that we'll cause is the argument from motion. The argument from motion. For Aquinas, there had to be a first mover. So if I take my pen, it's not going to move unless I do something to make it move. We won't talk about gravity here in this, but here, let me do it this way. So my you can't really see it. If I propped up my phone like a domino here in front of the screen, it's going to stay like that unless I use my finger and tip it over. And if this were a series of dominoes, you know what's going to happen. They're all going to begin to fall in sequence. And so for Aquinas, his first way of his 5 ways for knowing is that everything is simply, it needs something to begin its movement. And so there had to be a first mover, or as Aquinas called it, the prime mover, which he concluded was God. So the prime mover is God. In similar fashion, and very similar to it, is what he called the first cause. So things don't just exist; they have to have a reason to exist. And so, very similar to the prime mover was the idea of the first cause. And he looked at 2 types of cause: efficient cause and necessary cause. The efficient cause is why things are. The necessary cause is sometimes referred to as the third, the eternal cause, as it's also called. So the first is from motion, the second is from cause, the third is necessity. The prime mover, the first cause, and the eternal cause. Those 3 really are very similar. There's hardly a distinction. What do they say? It's a definition without a distinction. Aquinas saw it as 3 distinct ways of looking at the existence or proving the existence of God, whereas in truth they're very similar in their application and their understanding. So the argument from motion, the argument from cause, and the argument from necessity. But then the next 2 go a little bit further into a different in a different direction for proving the existence of God. And so the fourth way of understanding the existence of God is by degree. So Aquinas argued that, let's do it this way. I've got 4 pencils here. We're going to say this pencil is better than this one, which is better than this one, which is better than this one. And if I were to grade them, I would grade them as one being better than the other. You can do that. So, for example, with cars, an Alfa Romeo is better than an Audi, which is better than a Volkswagen Jetta. So by gradation, I look at those cars and I say, I understand the Jetta. I drive the Jetta. I aspire to the Audi, but not even an Audi will be as good as an Alfa Romeo or as a Rolls Royce. So you look at gradation in things and you understand that in every situation you can almost always imagine something better, a better grade of being, a better standard of existing, a better standard of being. And so his fourth way of knowing that there is a God is that if you can always imagine that, then eventually you get back to what must be perfection, and therefore that perfection must exist and be in God, must be God. And then there is design, the argument from design. I don't know, 15 years ago, there was a big argument about teaching evolution in schools, and where they could not teach evolution, they wanted to teach intelligent design. And they said that that was not a theological argument, it was a philosophical argument, intelligent design. And so they talked about, so Aquinas then would talk about understanding that everything is created, and if we can only understand for what it was designed, then we will have to see that there was a designer, there was a creator. For that, we would say that that is a teleological argument. You have to look down through, you have to see its purpose, you have to see its design, you have to know its end in order to fully understand it. And once you understand that, then you can't help but believe that there was an intelligent designer, and that designer we call God. And so those are Aquinas' 5 ways. You can read them in the textbook, and if you want more explanation about that. But Aquinas also dealt with some other things. Sorry about that. That was a text message coming in. Aquinas also dealt with some other issues, namely the problem of theodicy. Theodicy, Theodicy, theodicy. Theodicy is understood as the problem of evil. And Aquinas said, for example, when trying to understand evil, he said that God did not create evil. Evil exists because of human free will, and humans choose, or humanity chooses what it thinks is good, but that very often produces evil. God created the possibility of evil, but God did not create evil. And with creating the possibility of evil, he gave humans gave a human's free will. And so that's how he explained evil existing in the world. You might remember that St. Augustine explained evil in the world as a declension. The fall, as things decline, that is the source then of evil in the world. Aquinas understands the problem of evil as God creating the possibility of evil and then giving humanity free will and humans choose what they think is good, but it's not actually good. And so that's then what creates evil in the world. He believed that God created the world ex nihilo, out of nothing. So God created the world out of nothing. And Aquinas believed that to achieve happiness, we have to fulfill our natural capacities. Sorry, just getting a message in and it distracted me. And Aquinas believed that the natural capacity of humans and the end goal of humans was the love of God. And that if we make right choices, we will achieve our human capacity. So if we always act with the motivation of loving God, then we will achieve our natural capacity and we will be happy. And freedom is necessary then for us to make those choices and achieve that happiness. So to have that free will, then if we choose to love God and follow God, then we'll be moral and we'll be happy. Aquinas also developed, and I'll begin to wrap it up with this, 4 kinds of law. 4 kinds of law. I'll lay them out and then I'll explain them. Eternal law, natural law, human law, and divine law. So 4 types of laws. Just like he had 5 ways of knowing the existence of God, he also understood that, or believed that there were 4 kinds of law. The eternal law. The eternal law is the universe guided by divine reason. So even though he did not understand that the Earth orbits around, that the moon orbits around the Earth and the Earth orbits around the sun, he did not understand that. He did believe that the universe was guided by divine reason, divine principles, and that he called eternal law. Natural law, he understood as a portion of eternal law that pertains to people. So natural law then goes back to what I was explaining earlier about us doing what is natural. And for Aquinas, to follow, to love God is the natural order of humans, and so that will make us happy. And it's only when we do something that contravenes or interferes with that that we become unhappy and that we do evil. Human law, he understood as the government that God had ordained and had given to humanity. And divine law, he understood as that law that can direct humans to supernatural ends. That law that can direct humans to supernatural ends. For him, divine law then was Scripture. So his 5 types of laws were eternal law, natural law, human law, and divine law. Divine law is Scripture. Human law is what we understand as government. Natural law is a portion of eternal law that pertains to humanity, and eternal law is that divine reason that guides the universe and all that we see in the universe. So I've tried to cover a lot of ground with you today. I hope you followed this. I will be posting this video. I will shortly. I've got an appointment that I have to leave for any minute now, so I apologize, but I will get your readings up to you very shortly. I will also post everything else, but you will at least, I will also post a quiz, but you will at least have this, lecture to begin to watch. All right, guys, thank you. I hope you're staying healthy and safe. Remember, stay home. That's why we're doing this. Believe me, this is more work for me to lecture this way than it is to come into class. So stay home and appreciate being able to learn in this format. Oh, I meant to show you one final thing. So if you want to read more about Aquinas, I've got, I will put up an article for you. I will post that. But I thought I would just show you. So if you want to read more about Aquinas, just to give you an idea of how thick that is, that's volume 1. Volume 2, volume 3. And if you have trouble just to show you then also all Aquinas is writing there, and you see how small that font is. That's without any explanation. The commentary on Aquinas is also three volumes about this thick as well. So be glad that I kind of distilled it for you in the way that I did. Guys, again, stay healthy, stay safe, and look for the rest of your assignments to be posted shortly. Have a good day.